Dr. Ben Mudd, Executive Director of the KPHA, the Kentucky Pharmacists Association, on the PBM Reform Podcast. You don't want to miss it.
You are listening to the Pharmacy Podcast Network.
Welcome to the PBM Reform Podcast, where we dive deep into the world of pharmaceutical benefit management, cutting through the noise to uncover the truth. Since 2019, we've been your go-to source for the latest on how PBMs impact patient care, drug pricing, and the very future of pharmacy. Here, we champion the role of pharmacists, the most knowledgeable advocates for medication safety and expertise. Join us as we expose and generate discussions that are reshaping healthcare and explore how we build a better payment system which focuses on advancing pharmacy care.
Hey, welcome back to the PBM Reform Podcast. The host is here today. He's exhausted. He's been traveling through airports and train stations and renting cars and riding camels to get to Washington, D.C. with all of the incredible things that are happening. PBM reform is really moving forward. Greg Reybold with APCI, sponsorship of the PBM Reform Podcast. You guys have been instrumental in building what is now the second most popular show on our network. And it's racing after This Week in Pharmacy. So you might beat it by the end of the year, Greg. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks, Todd. Who's the host of This Week in Pharmacy? I got to watch out for that guy.
Me, I am. But I don't ever want it to be about me. I want it to be about pharmacists doing things. And that's why when you text me less than 48 hours ago and said, hey, we got Dr. Ben Mudd coming on the show, I was freaking out because I've been watching Ben for a while. His work, his advocacy, his understanding, the fact that he is a pharmacist and really has his fingers on the pulse in the state of Kentucky. So with that, you take it away, Greg.
Yes, awesome. Thank you, Todd. Always good to see you. Ben, thank you. Super short notice here. I'm lucky that Ben's even still talking to me, right? Because how many, you've come through on probably 10 short notice requests in the last 2 weeks, and have just been instrumental in so many things that we've been working on. Thrilled to have you here. Excited to have you here. We needed to have you on anyway, but huge week, obviously, in pharmacy, at the federal level for 6610, Pharmacists Fight Back Act. And you've played just an unbelievably central role in that. Want to talk about that. But that aside, there's so much I think that pharmacists in this country and policymakers that listen to the podcast need to know about you. So welcome to the show, and I'd love to start out with you just talking a little bit about your role in Kentucky and some of the just unbelievable wins that Kentucky has had at the state level before we even get to sort of the really big week that we've had.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for the invite. Short notice or not, I'm honored to be here with you today and to highlight, some of the great accomplishments that we've seen. And as you have mentioned, it's been a great week for pharmacy across the country, and the momentum that's been built at the federal level on some PBM bills, and a lot of kudos to your work for really helping kind of steer the ship and getting some movement there. You mentioned Kentucky and the work that we've done, and we first of all always want to give credit to all. There's so many people that help along the way, and Kentucky's blessed to have some really good, strong advocates in the independent pharmacy world. And it really kind of started with we created a single PBM bill, which is Senate Bill 50. That was in 2020. So before I became executive director, I was still practicing pharmacy at the time, and that was a huge shift for community pharmacy in Kentucky. Pharmacies were really struggling in Medicaid. We had 6 MCOs at the time. Reimbursement was all over the place. All of them were bad. Some of them were worse than others. And it took the leadership of Senator Max Wise, who now is the Senate Majority Floor Leader in the Kentucky Senate, to champion that bill. And everybody was talking about how it's going to bankrupt the state and all the negative things that we always hear. And he believed the pharmacists in Kentucky, the pharmacists back in his district. He saw the abuses that were happening. We created the single PBM, and then they did a report that showed that it had some significant cost savings for the state. So fast forward to 2024, we took those same kind of principles of cost plus and put that into Senate Bill 188, which was commercial PBM reform. And so that went into effect for independent community pharmacies in 2025, and it will go into effect for all community pharmacies in 27. Interestingly, we want to highlight part of that bill. It was very comprehensive, but it did have the NADAC plus the dispensing fee. It required that the Department of Insurance do a cost dispensing study. So it was 1064, the Medicaid rate, and we just heard back from the Department of Insurance in the past week that rate effective January 1 of 27 will go from 1064 to $16.31, which is what they factored as the average cost to dispense a prescription.
Wow. I mean, that's big news. And, so many states, it's been the same dispensing fee forever, right? There haven't been these new surveys. So, and, that's something to me, it's always so interesting, right? But that didn't happen overnight, right? You all got that in there. It took time, but here you are. And that's significant. And it's also, just talking to independent pharmacists across the country for the last several years, that number feels about right, in terms of like what are the actual sunken costs to dispense.
Yeah, that only applies to commercial, but now that we have that data, I mean, I think it's worth exploring what that looks like in Medicaid, because to my knowledge, I don't think Kentucky's ever done a study in Medicaid. That I believe that was like a national average that they used. So, but it's provided some relief for pharmacies, and I think this is a good lead in to 6609, 6610. It's the same model, right? It works for pharmacies. It works on the other side to provide some transparency into what's being paid. And I think, you all really took that model of NADAC Plus and applied it to, the Pharmacists Fight Back Act. And I tell people all the time, pharmacists get this. They can read that piece of legislation and understand how it's going to impact them. And it really motivates people to get involved and advocate, because they can see what the impact is going to be. They can feel that. We've done it now in Medicaid and commercial. So pharmacists, they understand that this is a fair and reasonable approach to Medicare and our federal plans. So it's not surprising the amount of people that called their legislators, called their congressmen and women to advocate for them to sponsor this bill.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I want to talk about 6610 here, although I just want to, you mentioned Max Wise, and man, right? Like, I think, he's sort of a pedigreed, recognized, by the folks who are certainly in this business as one of the, the best legislators in terms of understanding, pushing back, being just an amazing champion. I'm not a big believer in coincidences, right? And from my perspective, Kentucky's got a lot of, there's a pattern here, right? You all have cultivated and worked with and are, blessed to have, Max Wise, who is, one of the best in the country at the state level. But Kentucky has figured centrally into 6610, pharmacists, really 6609 and 6610, Pharmacists Fight Back Act, and even the previous iteration, because Kentucky has also, one of the biggest champions at the federal level, right, is chairman of Oversight Committee, James Comer. And he was absolutely instrumental in helping to build momentum for Pharmacists Fight Back, recognition for Pharmacists Fight Back, even credibility for Pharmacists Fight Back Act at the federal level, having somebody like that. And so I just love to, and it was clear, right? You were up in, you came up to DC in December when the bill was reintroduced, and it was clear, right? Like you've got a wonderful relationship with Chairman Comer, and it was, even clearer this week when you were up there. So before we sort of get into the details of the bill, just sort of talk about your view of how you develop these relationships, and is there a secret sauce to helping cultivate just some of the best pharmacy champions in the country? Because at the state level you've got it, and at the federal level you've got it, and I don't think that that's a coincidence.
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of it is, right people, right time kind of thing. Max Wise and I both live in the 1st Congressional District of Kentucky. So it helps that the congressman is my congressman. I'm a constituent, and he represents the far western part of Kentucky, but the district kind of loops around and comes back up to Frankfort. So I remember attending the NCPA fly-in when I was a practicing pharmacist, my first year working for Medica Pharmacy, and Comer had just got elected, and he was brand new and he knew nothing about PBMs. He had some close friends that were pharmacists, but it's taken probably a decade of advocating for these changes and just education and staying in touch with his office. And we're blessed to have him be there that long, but he's also maintained his staff. Like, you see so much turnover in congressional offices, and he's got some incredible staff members that have remained on his team the entire time, or for the majority of it. And the same with the oversight staff. Like, we've had some tenure there where we've been able to build those relationships, when oftentimes you don't get that. I mean, people leave offices and then you start from the ground up and try to start building those relationships. Absolutely. So it has been, we've been lucky, blessed in that way, to have this much time to work on these things. And it does just take time. And then, it all kind of comes together at a point here where we've got the momentum. We've done some work at the state level, which you see so often. Things have to work at the state level, and then they kind of work their way to DC. And we've just been fortunate to have those relationships. But his pharmacy owners are, he's got some great advocates in his district. I don't know. I'd be interested to look across all congressional districts. I would say he probably has, top 10 most independent pharmacies in one congressional district, and that helps, right? Because he's got one in most of his counties that he takes time to meet with and understand what they're facing.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned his staff, because staff certainly up on the Hill, maybe doesn't get talked about a lot, but so often, you meet with, and I feel like you mentioned the NCPA fly-in, right? And I think that's like, such a great initiation for pharmacists to partake and sort of get involved in the federal process. And but when you look at over the years, I remember, at some of these fly-ins in 2015, 2016, you'd go up there, nobody knew what PBMs were, right? Now you go up and people are like, oh, PBM, right? They at least, it's on their radar. And I think that's obviously credit to all the work that pharmacists have done going up to these fly-ins for years, along with NCPA. Everybody knows, hey, PBMs, right? And there's problems there and there's work to do there. But something that truly stands out to me with Comer's staff, and I'm going to say with his congressional staff in his office, but also oversight staff, right? Because he is the chairman of the Oversight Committee. And his staff members have such a unique knowledge of PBMs and PBM practices that it absolutely stands out. And that's not a coincidence, right? I think that's also, a byproduct of, and like you said, this doesn't happen overnight, right? It's years and years and years of I'm sure, like working with that office and raising issues. And Chairman Comer, co-lead of Pharmacists Fight Back Act, but as chairman of Oversight, he's had some of the best PBM hearings that we've seen, I would argue, in the country, right? Whether it's the state level or the federal level. I harken back, the one that jumps out to me was I think it was June of 2024 when he had the execs of the PBMs there. And man, that was a hearing.
That was great. Yeah. And they, did the study and report that's been helpful.
Yes.
I mean, it's just been great. And again, so go back to all the things kind of collide at once, and we also have Chairman Guthrie from Kentucky over energy and commerce, which is, hopefully we can continue to work with him and try to get some movement on 6609. But it's kind of wild how this particular matter has really, Kentucky's been a focal point of moving forward.
I know I've said this to you, right? I think it was probably in December, but it feels like all roads lead through Kentucky, right? And so for context, you just mentioned it, but out of Kentucky, you've got Chairman Comer, who's over Oversight, which has jurisdiction of 6610, which operates in the Federal Employee Health Benefits Plan, and then Energy and Commerce. The chairman of that committee is Chairman Guthrie, also out of Kentucky, and that's where 6609, which acts in Medicare and Medicaid. It's really that's something, isn't it?
It's awesome. Yeah, I mean, John Vincent may disagree that all things PBM come through Kentucky, but maybe they head over to Arkansas for a day or two. But yeah, I mean, it's wild how it's kind of all come together. But I think just honored to be able to help, and it's been a as an independent pharmacist, I can't, this is like a dream job, to be able to go out and help really make some change for all of our colleagues across the nation. I think we probably need to kind of dive in on 6610 and,
yes, sir. Yeah.
And what's it going to do and how we got where we are today and what's our path forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And so 6610 and 6609 were introduced in December, and there was a press conference with the introduction, and you were there, right? You showed up and along with some other Kentucky pharmacists. Yeah. And so if you kind of love to start there, and why you showed, and one of the connections I'd like to make is Kentucky has a track record of winning at the state level. And I think, you very much brought that mentality to the federal level as well. Yeah.
Well, I think that was the coldest day last year in D.C. It was brutally cold. And we had pharmacists from all across the country show up to show their support. And that was the second one we had done, right? There was the Pharmacists Fight Back in the previous Congress.
That's right. Yep.
And that was well attended as well. And that was like kind of the first time this model really was out there, a cost plus model in legislation, and didn't get a lot of traction in the last Congress. So reintroduced it this year, dividing it. Before it was like all federal programs it's going to apply, and that's just that's a big lift. So kudos to you or whomever decided to kind of break this up into different bills. The 6610 is just focused on the Federal Employee Health Plan, and then 6609 is same Pharmacists Fight Back, but it applies to Medicare and Medicaid, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. And that, we haven't mentioned him yet, right? But the author of both bills is Congressman Auchincloss, and that was his thought was, hey, let's break these up, so that they're operating in separate committees. And boy, that turned out to be a pretty sharp decision, I think.
Brilliant, yeah, and great call out there. Congressman Auchincloss has been a great champion for pharmacy too, It shows bipartisan support for sure, and the vote on Wednesday sure showed that as well, 40-2, with one Republican and one Democrat voting no, and shame on those people. But ton of bipartisan support, and so go back to the previous Congress. Like, we had some momentum, but I think it was like people
50 co-sponsors, right? That was not insignificant. I think it was a good first showing, but it didn't have forward momentum beyond that.
Yeah, and so it's just like this slow momentum, the slow build of people understanding what it's going to do, and getting more support from our national pharmacy associations to come on board and show their support. But again, like, as more states have moved either in Medicaid, or we now have some other states that have this similar model in commercial, and people see the real impact on their pharmacy and what they're able to provide for their communities, then they now understand this is the path forward. And that's, we've been able to get that support. So, kudos to you again, Greg. I mean, it's so hard to say, like, thanks to you, but like, so many people have helped with this, but you really kind of been the focal point of keeping everybody on the same page, I feel like, and countless days and nights in DC to help on this. But it's just been slowly over time kind of building up. And then maybe a couple months ago really started the process of finalizing what became the substitute during the committee the other day. And we were, again, fortunate that there were a lot of different stakeholders that came and asked for some significant changes that you knew would be harmful to the bill and lessen its impact. And we really just were able to kind of hold the line and still get out of there with a really, really strong bill. I think probably the biggest concession we had to make was, it doesn't go into effect for 2 years versus 1. And we would have liked it to be immediate, right? But sometimes as we don't always get everything we want, but the bill stayed by far and large intact from its original version.
It did, and in one I think interesting way that I think a lot of pharmacists noticed and were excited is, in one way, it actually got stronger, right? And we can talk a little bit about the process, but it went from, I think, a $10,000 fine per violation to PBMs to what was it? Was it
$1 million?
Yeah. So obviously, massive bump up in fine amount, which I know I was certainly happy to see. But I'm so glad you mentioned, right? Because again, kudos to Chairman Comer and his whole team, because there were a lot of interests that wanted to significantly weaken this bill, and there were provisions that were proposed that in many ways would have gutted the bill. But here's to me what I think is so important. Relationships matter, and I think we've talked about that, right? Like how it takes time and engagement, and obviously Kentucky, I think, is very much a model for the rest of the country on how relationships matter at the state level. But there's no magic at the federal level, right? Like, relationships matter there too. I think for some people, federal seems so esoteric, and so many pharmacists are comfortable engaging with their state representatives, their state senators. But maybe at the federal level, it seems more inaccessible. But I think Kentucky is a beautiful role model to show that it's the same concept, right? It's these relationships and taking the time to invest in them that makes such a difference. But what you just said is something I've been so impressed with you about, as well as others in Kentucky too. But it's not just relationships, but details matter, right? And you played, I think, very much a material role in rolling up your sleeves when you didn't necessarily have to. You got a state that you're worried about, but you rolled up your sleeves and you read through some of these proposed changes by whether it's agencies or industry interests, and you personally took the time to go through that bill with a fine-tooth comb, right? And I was so impressed with that, because yes, relationships are part of the secret sauce. But it's also just doing the work and paying attention. And, obviously attorney for better or worse, right? But details matter and words matter, and there are times where semicolons matter and commas matter. And I was just so impressed with the level of detail that you brought to that aspect too.
Yeah, and when you deal with the PBM legislation, you have you're so suspicious of any change, because you're right, man. One word can take a 20-page bill and basically make it void and do nothing. And our opposition, they have teams of attorneys and that look through things and are like, well, can we just get this one little change? And then,
they're masters at it.
Yeah, and that one little change just canceled out 5 years worth of work. So you have to go through it page by page. And I think we were 20 plus pages on this draft. But it worked out, and that's the thing. You make a good point. There's the politics side, the relationship side, but then you got to have people that are good on the policy side, looking at the actual words and how that's going to impact. And you got to pull the two together, because if you don't have both, then you'll lose your momentum. And I think we're lucky here in Kentucky to have a really strong association, and always want to give my colleagues across the country a shout out for the work they're doing, because there's a lot of thankless work in the Pharmacy Association world, and
it's a tough business. Doubt.
It and just encourage people. It's even if your state's not doing exactly what you want, or you feel like there's no momentum, you got to get behind your state pharmacy associations and be a member, if nothing else, just to show that support. But we have KIPA, the Independent Pharmacy Alliance here in Kentucky. They were a big part of getting everybody
Absolutely
on the same page, and they are Rosemary and her team and Luther, her husband, are incredible at really rallying the troops.
And Rosemary's a dynamo, right?
He's in that a call to action, man, and they do that. So, I think that just shows we all got to work together, from your state associations to national associations to good folks at APCI, to all kind of get in the same direction, row in the same direction. And the pharmacy voice is very powerful if we all speak the same, sing from the same book and row in the right direction. We can have an impact. And I think that this bill has shown that. And that is one of the coolest things that I've experienced working on this particular matter is how much everybody's getting behind this, and that we've been able to be effective.
Yeah. And now I'm realizing, right? And my defense here, it has been a long week. I'm tired, but I'm realizing that I don't know that I ever even really set the stage for listeners to understand exactly what did transpire this week, right?
Yeah.
and so I'll ask you to do that, right? Because this was a big week for HR 6610, which is Pharmacists Fight Back within the Federal Employee Health Benefits Program, and this was a really big week. We were both up in DC for it, and I think you being there and it helped make the day, from my perspective, really so neat and special, something I'll always remember. But, if I'll look to you to sort of tell our listeners what exactly did transpire on the bill this week.
Yeah. So they held a markup, and in a state term, that would mean that we've essentially moved the bill out of the House committee. There's 4 steps to pass a bill prior to it going to the governor, in this case, president's signature. You got to go through, a committee of jurisdiction, then it's going to move on to the House floor, and then it'll move over to the Senate. And we know that, technically it may not pass in that way, but it's got to make it through the committee of jurisdiction before it can be considered in a larger package or as a standalone bill.
It's a massive, It's a massive step for it to be
huge.
Right. Flexibility wise, it now puts it in a position where there are moves to potentially make.
Exactly. And, at the state level, at least in Kentucky, I'm sure states are different. We just have a hearing. It goes through a committee meeting, and it's like a one-step process. And you talk about the bill, if there's amendments, and then they pass it out of committee. Well, in this markup, phase of the legislation in DC is that equivalent. So they've held previous hearings on PBM reform in general. As you alluded to, I think they've had 3 just in oversight. But they weren't talking about necessarily a single bill.
Right.
It was just like the issue of PBMs. Now that this has been, had the blessing of the committee, it can move forward and now can be included in other legislation. And so it is a huge deal. I mean, you follow federal policy probably more than I do, but we don't see that a lot. There's just not a lot of bills that make it out of committee.
It's frankly very, very rare. And, Pharmacists Fight Back Act, again, is, at the federal level in terms of reimbursement, in terms of steering, in terms of ending the ability for PBMs to massively mark up medications at pharmacies that they own, enforcement, prohibiting retroactive fees. This isn't just a piece of pharmacy legislation and patient legislation, but it is really the most comprehensive legislation to address those things, that's been introduced. And for it to move through the committee process is a massive deal. And I want to talk about, something you're working on here shortly, but it's a comment I got last week from a pharmacist, and I understand sort of the frustration of this, but I hear it a lot, which is sort of like, hey, like nobody cares, right? And I hear that from time to time, and I think over even the last few weeks, and I don't want to talk about this specifically today, but there was an Armed Services Subcommittee meeting last week, and Senator Warren, as the ranking member, could have picked any issue within Armed Services within that jurisdiction to hold a committee hearing on anything. Right. And she decided to hold it on, really Express Scripts practices in the TRICARE pharmacy program. And she could have picked anything. And, Oversight Committee has massive jurisdiction, right? They touch so many things. And Chairman Comer, there are literally hundreds of interests and industries that would kill to have the chairman of Oversight be a champion of their issue or be a champion for their patients or their clients, right? Chairman Comer of Oversight, massive jurisdiction, and he decided to co-lead this bill. And not only to co-lead this bill, right, but he moved the largest piece of really PBM reform legislation that we've seen through the committee process. There is work to do, and we can talk about that. There's massive work to do. But this was a milestone week for pharmacy, and Chairman Comer, I think, has time and time again has proven just how important this issue is to him. But boy, that's a big deal.
It is, and I hope people understand that, and it is to get where we came from to where we are. Just all of the pieces of the puzzle. It is certainly a chess game, and we're far from the end. But things are moving forward, and it was a great week. And what a time to be in DC. I talked about the first meeting we had with Comer when I was working as a practicing pharmacist, and I think that was definitely my first trip to DC as a pharmacist.
And that was the fly-in you said, right?
Yeah. And the family that owned the pharmacy was adamant that you had to be an advocate. You had to go up there to circle all the way back around to what we experienced this week. Man, that's great. To see that in your professional life is really it's a neat opportunity to see it come full circle. So
that's cool. Yeah, that is neat. And we talked about obviously the time that you spent, the level of detail that you spent working on, looking at like potential amendments that other parties had proposed. But so much went into that hearing, right? The hearing may have looked quick and in certain ways maybe not dramatic, but hours upon hours were spent by Chairman Comer and his team, right? And I'll say his team within his congressional office, but also the oversight team. I mean, they invested a massive amount of time into this, and it's because the issue is important to the chairman. So I think that's pretty neat. I'd ask for any sort of final takeaways you have from the week. But after that, I'd love to pivot, right? Because we talked about sort of the culture of winning that you've been instrumental in bringing in Kentucky at the state level and then the federal level. And I just want to talk a little bit about you're in the midst of another really pretty neat thing, which is, and so I want to get to that too. But any sort of parting thoughts on sort of the week and Pharmacists Fight Back Act, and then after that, talk to us about what you got going at the state level personally.
Yeah, well, I don't know where. I'm assuming that the final version that came out of committee is available and online, and maybe we can include that somewhere in a link for people to read. It's a lengthy bill, but people can understand it when you read it and you see the impact. I would encourage people to take a few minutes to read that and have a real firm understanding of what it's going to do. I think they'll like it. But yeah. I think you're alluding to my Senate race.
Yes,
I catch that.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I noted here, I misspoke. The penalty in the bill, I believe, is $10 million per time that they violate the terms. So
it went from what was it, 10,000 per violation to 10 million per violation.
That's correct. Yeah.
Love it.
After 10 occurrences, they can be debarred from being the PBM for the federal employee health plan. So that's a big deal,
I love it. Right, 10 million fine. I think it caps out at 100, but then there's sequential imposition, which is really important, which means it can all happen, at once together, and then ultimately debarment.
Yeah. So it's got some teeth to it, which is what you got to have. So this is so much fun, and I've watched the likes of Max Wise and James Comer and impact that they've had across many sectors and represent their constituents. So my current senator decided he was going to retire. A good friend of Brittany and I, Senator Jimmy Higdon, been in the legislature here in Kentucky for 24 years. Decided he was going to retire and decided last year in September that I'd run for Kentucky State Senate. So we had obviously an open seat, 7-way primary in the Republican primary, and
7-way. That's like a knife fight of a primary. 7. Wow.
Yeah, and it was a brutal last couple of weeks. I got a little ugly there for a bit, but we made it out alive and head on to November. So the November 3rd will be the general election. Do have an opponent in that race as well. So
you're in the midst of a general election, and you're running an association, and you still somehow had the time or the will to come to DC for a very, very long day, man. Thank you.
Yeah. And have the pharmacy. I always like to throw that out there. Very, very proud of that. To have, it's been a lifelong dream to own an independent pharmacy, and I have 2 great partners that have allowed me to be a part of that. So, always proud to throw that out there. So I thought we had it bad because we left Kentucky. I left my house at 3:00 a.m. and we got back at midnight that night. I was like, man, it's a 21-hour day until you hear your story of canceled flights and driving to DC from Georgia. That was
it was rough. And we haven't mentioned her, but somebody on the APCI team who I love and is one of the most amazing people I know is Kathy Hanna. And Kathy is, so instrumental in all of this. And oh my God. So she had to fly in from Kentucky to Atlanta to go to DC, and she got to Atlanta and the flight was canceled the same night. I mean, she had just it was like a saga for like what Todd was saying, right? Like planes, trains, and automobiles. And then she finally got home, and she's in Texas now, I think at the pharmacy convention. So her journey's for the week are still not over. So it was, but we all managed to make it. Look, it's funny. I don't know that this has come up a lot on the PBM Reform podcast, but when you look at sort of some of the states and at the federal level, right? Like having pharmacists in office is so important, right? And Georgia, that we currently have 2 pharmacists. There have been times where we've had 4 or 5, and Tennessee and Alabama, and and obviously at the federal level to have Congressman Buddy Carter and Harshbarger, amazing, right? Because they get it, and colleagues trust them, and when they have questions, some of this stuff is complicated, right? And to have a pharmacist in whether it's the state house or at the federal level, to have somebody who's an expert on drug pricing and who understands how these things impact patients, big deal.
Yeah. Well, it's not for the faint of heart, but definitely encourage people to consider it. I mean, we pharmacists are really well positioned to help in legislatures across the country. We not only on drug pricing, but healthcare in general. It's policy heavy.
It's policy heavy, yes, sir.
And there's not a lot of, no offense to our attorneys, a lot of attorneys in legislatures, but there's just it's very difficult to continue to practice and be in a legislature, even a part-time like Kentucky. So it's definitely a sacrifice, but pharmacists have always stepped up to serve our communities. And you go to these rural communities all across the country, and they're on school boards, they're on city councils, they serve, but and I'm always open to have a conversation with the colleague about, what it's like to run, and hopefully we'll know what it's like to win come November and serve. But just we need more people to step up and run and represent their communities, but also serve as leaders for our profession.
I agree. And when you look at it in the various states, and I certainly don't track all of it, but so often over time, pharmacists end up being in really influential positions, whether it's federal or at the state. And again, I think it's a testament to the integrity that pharmacists have, the role that they play in their community, the ability to understand the health implications and the complex policy. So it's certainly something I would encourage. And I think we've covered a lot of ground here. I think we definitely have to get you back, maybe when things slow down for you a little bit. Yeah. If pharmacists want to support you and what you're doing in this race, is there anything that they can do from afar? What can they do to help you?
Yeah, well, I appreciate the call out there for sure. Wasn't expecting that, but we have an active website, votemud.com, MUDD, votemud.com, and you can go on there and there's a place to donate, learn more about the campaign. If you're close by and want to come knock on some doors, and we'll take all the help we can get with calls and whatnot. So. Definitely appreciate. I look our beautiful family there, visit that and learn more about the campaign, and feel free to reach out anytime.
Awesome. Well, I would certainly encourage all our listeners to go check it out, and if they're so inclined, I always say, right, rising tide lifts all ships. The work that has been done in Kentucky and Arkansas and, some of these other states have instructed and informed and raised, pharmacy policy across the country. And, the work that you're doing is impacting states, it's impacting the federal level. And boy, I think you obviously, quick become just an amazing leader in the Senate as well. So, Ben, anything else you want to say? But so grateful for everything you're doing for pharmacy, state level, federal level, and so excited about your race. And thank you for being on.
Yeah, well, and thank you, and thanks for the opportunity. I don't want to go back and forth and exchange thank yous too many times, but we always got to give credit to you, Greg. You've been great again, keeping everybody informed, keeping us together, kind of keeping that one voice moving forward. Thank you for everything you've done. And I had a happy student with me, and I'll end with this story. Yes. On our flight home, he was inquiring about your history. He was like, "Now, is Greg a pharmacist?" And I'm like, "No, he works for APCI," kind of explaining your background. He's like, how do you get this much passion for pharmacy if you're not a pharmacist. And I'm like, I don't exactly know how, but you got it, man. Like you love this just as much as we do. And we're so fortunate to have your leadership and support along the way.
Well, I appreciate it. And I say this a lot, but I think it's a testament to pharmacists, right? And I think pharmacists are and the work that you do inspires passion in so many people. And I think that's why pharmacy has as many champions as it does in state houses and at the federal level, right? I think it's a testament to pharmacists and what you do and the care you provide. So, man, thank you for coming on. I promise you won't hear from me. I won't bother you for at least 2 weeks. I know you've had your fill.
Hey, to shout out to all of our listeners, our pharmacists, pharmacy owners, and pharmacy technicians, do not forget to reach out to your state representatives and invite them to your pharmacy, educate them on what you're doing for your community. When you tell those stories, it's contextual, it starts to gel, they start to understand how impactful our pharmacies are to our communities and to public health. A shout out to Greg and APCI. Thank you so much to the American Pharmacy Cooperative for sponsoring another episode of the PBM Reform Podcast. And don't forget to take a look at Vote Mudd, MUDD. That's votemud.com. Ben, thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you.